The air in the Stamford Superior Court was thick with betrayal, a silent, suffocating fog. On the witness stand, Catherine Hayes wept her quiet sobs, the only sound punctuating the lawyer's ruthless questioning. Her life was being dismantled, piece by painful piece. Across the room in the gallery sat Vanessa Thorne, the other woman. As a tear traced a path down Catherine's cheek, Vanessa's lips curled into a subtle, triumphant smirk. It was a look of pure contempt, a silent mockery of a broken heart. But she and everyone else had underestimated the woman on the bench. Judge Evelyn Reed saw everything, and what she was about to say would not just change the course of the divorce, but would shatter lives and expose a lie so vast it would leave the entire courtroom breathless with shock. The house in Greenwich, Connecticut, was less a home and more a museum exhibit on wealth. It was a sprawling colonial of white clapboards and black shutters, set on 3 acres of manicured lawn that rolled down to a private sliver of the Long Island Sound. Inside the floors were Italian marble, cool and unforgiving underfoot, and the walls were adorned with abstract art that Richard Hayes had purchased at auctions Catherine was not invited to. Every surface was polished, every cushion plumped every room, a testament to the success of Hayes Construction, the company Catherine had helped her husband build from the ground up. In the early days, their life had been a whirlwind of shared dreams and dusty work sites. Catherine, a gifted architect with a degree from Cornell, had designed their first spec homes. Her vision, a blend of classic New England charm with modern open-concept living, had been the company's signature. She'd worked alongside Richard, poring over blueprints on their tiny apartment's dining table, her pencil sketching the future, while he charmed investors on a battered flip phone. She was the soul of the company. He was its face. But as the money flowed in a strange tide, pulled them apart, Richard insisted she step back. "You've done enough, darling," he'd said, his voice smooth as the aged whiskey he now preferred. "It's time you enjoyed the fruits of our labor. Let the new guys handle the designs. You should be planning parties, running the charity board." So she did. She traded her drafting table for a seat on the board of the Philharmonic. She swapped her worn-out jeans for Chanel suits. She became Mrs. Richard Hayes, a perfect hostess in a perfect house, her architectural ambitions relegated to a dusty portfolio in the attic. The house was her design, her masterpiece, but it had become her gilded cage. The soaring ceilings seemed to mock her grounded dreams, and the vast empty rooms echoed with the silence of a life unlived. The distance from Richard became a physical ache. He travelled constantly. For business, he'd claim. Board meetings in Tokyo, site inspections in Dubai, investor conferences in London. He would return smelling of unfamiliar perfume and the sterile air of a first-class cabin, offering her a duty-free trinket as a placating gesture. She accepted them with a practiced smile, the beautiful boxes feeling as hollow as his excuses. Doubt a seed planted years ago had grown into a suffocating vine. It was in the way he angled his phone away from her, the sudden password protection on his laptop, the late-night conference calls that sounded more like whispered conversations. Catherine felt like a ghost in her own life, haunting the hallways of a marriage that was already dead. The truth, when it came, was not a dramatic confrontation, but a small, careless piece of paper. Richard was supposedly in Chicago for a concrete suppliers convention. Catherine was sorting his travel receipts for their accountant, a mundane task. She still performed a relic of their shared past. Tucked between a receipt for a steak dinner and an Uber ride was a folio from a hotel she didn't recognize, the Chateau Marmont in Los Angeles. The dates matched his Chicago trip. The room service charges were for 2 champagne flutes, 2 orders of wild salmon, 2 servings of chocolate lava cake. The marble floor felt like a sheet of ice beneath her feet. She sank onto a minimalist sofa that offered no comfort, the crisp paper trembling in her hand. It wasn't just the lie. It was the casual, arrogant carelessness of it. He hadn't even bothered to hide it properly. It was as if she didn't matter enough for him to expend the effort. She went to his study, a room panelled in dark mahogany that always smelled of leather and self-importance. She had a sudden, desperate need to find more, to confirm the shape and size of the wound he had inflicted. She remembered him mentioning a new briefcase. She found it a pristine leather attaché from a ridiculously expensive brand. She fumbled with the gold clasps, her fingers clumsy with adrenaline. Inside, beneath a stack of contracts, was a small velvet jewelry box. Not for her. Her birthday and their anniversary had long passed. With a heart thudding against her ribs, she opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black satin, was a delicate diamond tennis bracelet. Tucked into the lining was a tiny folded card. Her breath hitched. She unfolded it. The handwriting was a feminine looping scrawl. "My dearest Ricky, last night was a dream. Can't wait to make our partnership official. All my love, V." The single initial hung in the air, a venomous dart. Catherine stood there in the silent, opulent house, the damning evidence in her hands, and finally understood. The echo she'd been hearing wasn't just emptiness. It was the sound of her entire world crumbling to dust. The confrontation was as cold and clinical as the house itself. Catherine waited until Richard returned, his face flushed with the success of a trip she now knew was a lie. He breezed in, dropping his keys into a porcelain bowl, with a clatter loosening his tie as he headed for the bar. "Tough trip," he announced to the room. "The concrete business is a real grind. How was your week, darling? Get that fundraiser sorted." Catherine didn't answer. She simply walked over and placed the hotel folio and the open jewelry box on the polished granite of the bar. She watched his face, a study in micro-expressions. First a flicker of confusion, then dawning realization, and finally a shuttered coldness that was more terrifying than any rage. He didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. He picked up the folio, glanced at it, and tossed it aside. "So you know." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same emotional detachment he used to discuss quarterly earnings. "Who is V?" Catherine's voice was a raw whisper, barely audible over the hum of the sub-zero refrigerator. "Vanessa Thorne," he said, pouring himself a 2-finger measure of scotch. He didn't offer her one. "She's a consultant for the company, a new hire." A consultant? The absurdity of the lie was a physical blow. The kind of consultant you buy diamond bracelets for and take to the Chateau Marmont. Richard took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes hard and dismissive. "Look, Catherine, let's not be dramatic. These things happen. Our marriage, it's been a business arrangement for years. You know that as well as I do." A business arrangement. She could feel a hysterical laugh bubbling in her throat. "I gave up my career for you, for this family, for this company. I designed the houses that made your name. We built this together. You drew some pictures 20 years ago." He sneered, his charm dissolving to reveal the ugly core beneath. "I built the empire. You've lived a life of unimaginable luxury because of me. You haven't had to work a day in 2 decades. Don't pretend you're some kind of martyr." Every word was a precision strike designed to diminish her, to erase her contribution, to rewrite their shared history into a simple transaction where she was a kept woman and he was the magnanimous provider. The love, the partnership, the late nights, all of it gone. Demolished. The next few days were a blur of numb activity. Richard packed a bag and moved into a penthouse suite at a downtown hotel, the one he likely shared with her. The lawyers were called. His was Gregory Vance, a man with a reputation as a shark, known for shredding spouses on the witness stand. Catherine, on the recommendation of a friend from the charity board, hired David Chen, a quieter, more methodical man, whose calm demeanor was a small island in her sea of chaos. The initial meeting took place in Chen's office, a modest space that felt worlds away from her Greenwich Museum. Bookshelves overflowed with legal texts, and the air smelled of paper and coffee. Catherine felt exposed and fragile as she recounted the story, her voice breaking as she explained her role in the company's founding. "We have a prenuptial agreement." She said the words tasting like ash. Richard insisted on it. "I didn't care at the time. I was in love. I thought it was just a piece of paper." Chen steepled his fingers, his expression thoughtful. "Prenups can be challenged, Catherine, especially in a long-term marriage where circumstances have significantly changed. Your non-financial contributions, raising your son, managing the household, and crucially your foundational work for the company all carry weight. He can't just erase 25 years of your life." But Richard was certainly going to try. The first offer that came from Vance's office was a calculated insult. It offered her the house, which he knew was mortgaged to the hilt for his business expansions, and a severance package that wouldn't last her 5 years, contingent on her signing a comprehensive NDA. It was the kind of offer you make to a fired employee, not the woman who helped lay the cornerstone of your entire life. "They're trying to intimidate you," Chen explained, his voice even. "They're painting a picture of you as a dependent, a non-working spouse, to minimize your claim on the business assets. The business is the real prize here." Hayes Construction was now worth over $200 million. Catherine's name wasn't on the corporate charter, another thing Richard had handled for her years ago, but her DNA was in its very foundation. The thought of Vanessa Thorne, this consultant, benefiting from her life's work, was a fresh stab of pain. The discovery process began a legal battlefield of paperwork. Chen requested years of financial records, corporate documents, and correspondence. Vance's team responded by burying them in a mountain of paper, thousands of pages of redacted, irrelevant documents designed to exhaust and overwhelm. It was during this period that Catherine saw Vanessa for the first time. It was an accident. Catherine was leaving Chen's office when a sleek black Porsche pulled up. A woman emerged, all long legs, sharp angles, and expensive sunglasses. She was younger, maybe in her late 30s, with a severe blonde bob and a look of fierce, unapologetic ambition. She was talking on her phone, her voice crisp and commanding. "No, tell the board the merger is non-negotiable. I've already run the numbers with Richard. We're moving forward." She paused, her cold eyes sweeping over Catherine, who stood frozen by the door. There was no recognition, just a flicker of dismissal, the way one might glance at a piece of furniture. Then she turned and strode into the building, the click of her heels on the pavement like tiny sharp hammers. Catherine knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this was her. This was V. And she wasn't just a mistress. She was positioning herself to be the new queen. The battle wasn't just for a settlement. It was for her identity, her history, and her future. The deposition took place in a sterile conference room in Gregory Vance's law firm. The room was dominated by a long, polished mahogany table that reflected the grim faces of everyone present. On one side sat Richard, looking tanned and infuriatingly relaxed, in a bespoke suit flanked by the formidable Vance. On the other sat Catherine with David Chen by her side, a stack of files forming a small fortress in front of him. A court stenographer sat at the head of the table, her fingers poised over her machine. But the most unnerving presence was in the corner of the room. Vanessa Thorne was there ostensibly as a key employee and consultant for Hayes Construction. She wasn't a participant, merely an observer, a role she played with relish. She wore a tailored crimson pantsuit, the colour of blood, and her expression was one of detached clinical interest. Every time Catherine spoke, Vanessa would make a small note on a leather-bound pad, a faint, unreadable smile playing on her lips. It was a calculated performance of power, meant to intimidate and unnerve. Vance began his questioning with a veneer of politeness that quickly curdled into condescension. His strategy was clear: to paint Catherine as an out-of-touch profligate housewife with no understanding of the business she claimed to have helped build. "Mrs. Hayes," he began, his voice silky, "could you please state for the record your current occupation?" "I do not have a paid occupation," Catherine said, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "I manage our household and family affairs and sit on several charity boards." "So it would be fair to say you have not been formally employed for, let's see, 24 years. If you mean I haven't drawn a salary, that is correct," Catherine replied, gripping her hands in her lap. "And during these 24 years, Vance continued, pacing slowly, you've enjoyed a certain lifestyle, have you not? The house in Greenwich, luxury cars, vacations in St. Bart's, a significant clothing allowance. Would you characterize your spending as modest? I would characterize it as the lifestyle my husband and I built together." "That you built?" Vance pounced. "Mrs. Hayes, can you tell me the current EBITDA for Hayes Construction?" "No, I cannot." "Can you explain the difference between a capital expenditure and an operating expense?" "Not in accounting terms, no." "Can you name the primary suppliers of reinforced steel for the company's high-rise projects?" It went on and on, a barrage of technical questions designed to highlight her ignorance of the company's day-to-day operations. With each, "I don't know," she could feel herself shrinking. She could feel Vanessa's gaze on her, sharp and judgmental. The smile on the woman's face widened almost imperceptibly. It was a vulture's smile, patient and predatory. David Chen objected periodically, citing relevance, but the damage was being done. Vance was crafting a narrative, and in his story, Catherine was nothing more than a pampered appendage to Richard's success. The most brutal part came when Vance brought up her architectural portfolio, the one Chen had submitted as evidence of her foundational role. "Mrs. Hayes, these are lovely drawings," Vance said, holding up a print of her first design. "Very quaint. You did these in, 1999? On a drafting board?" "Yes," Catherine said quietly. "Hayes Construction now uses advanced CAD software, 3D modeling, and architectural AI for its designs, correct?" he asked Richard, who nodded. "So would you agree, Mrs. Hayes," Vance said, turning back to her, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "that your skills, however charming they once were, are now completely obsolete in the context of a multi-million-dollar construction empire?" The word obsolete struck her like a physical blow. She looked across the table at Richard, hoping for a flicker of protest, a memory of the young woman who had worked tirelessly by his side. She saw nothing. His face was a mask of indifference. He was a stranger. Then her eyes slid to the corner where Vanessa sat. The other woman caught her gaze, and for a single breathtakingly cruel moment, her smile became a full-blown smirk. It was a look that said, "You lose. You are old news. I am the future." That was when Catherine's composure finally cracked. A hot tear escaped her eye and slid down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, mortified, but the damage was done. Vance saw it. Richard saw it. And Vanessa saw it. The deposition ended shortly after. As they packed their briefcases, Catherine felt a presence beside her. It was Vanessa. "I hope this all gets resolved quickly," Vanessa said, her voice smooth and utterly insincere. "For everyone's sake. Richard hates mess. She paused, her eyes flicking down to Catherine's simple dress and then back up. You know, the house could use some updating. The decor is a bit dated. I have some wonderful ideas. It was a declaration of war, a promise that she would not just take Catherine's husband and her money, but she would erase her very existence, redecorating over the life Catherine had so carefully built. Walking out of that building, Catherine felt utterly defeated. The legal system felt like a weapon being used against her, and she was unarmed. The truth didn't seem to matter. Her contributions, her sacrifices, they were being dismissed as quaint, obsolete. All that mattered was the narrative, and the other side was telling a much more convincing story. She had her memories, her pain, and her tears. They had the power, the money, and the vulture's smile. The Stamford Superior Court was an imposing building of granite and solemnity. The air inside courtroom 4B was cool, and still smelling faintly of old paper and wood polish. For Catherine, it felt like a final destination, the arena where the last bloody act of her marriage would play out. She sat beside David Chen at the plaintiff's table, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. She had chosen her outfit with care, a modest navy blue dress, a single strand of pearls her grandmother had given her. She wanted to look dignified, not destitute, a woman of substance, not a victim. But inside, she felt as fragile as glass. Across the aisle, Richard looked every bit the captain of industry. His silvering hair was perfectly coiffed, his navy suit impeccably tailored. He exuded an aura of calm authority, occasionally leaning over to whisper to Gregory Vance, who looked as sleek and dangerous as a panther. And there, in the first row of the public gallery, sat Vanessa Thorne. Today she was dressed in a chic, cream-coloured sheath dress, the picture of understated elegance. She sat with a perfect posture, her gaze fixed forward, a silent but potent symbol of Richard's new life. Her presence was a constant, throbbing humiliation. At the front of the room on the elevated bench sat Judge Evelyn Reed. She was a woman in her late 60s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Her reputation preceded her. She was known for being incredibly thorough, fair but firm, and having zero tolerance for theatrics or deceit. When she entered the room and everyone rose, a palpable sense of order settled over the proceedings. The day began with opening statements. Gregory Vance went first, his voice resonating with confidence. He painted a picture of a generous man, Richard Hayes, whose business genius had created immense wealth, and a wife who had benefited from that genius for decades without contributing anything of substance. He held up the prenuptial agreement as if it were scripture. Your Honor, Vance boomed. This is a simple case. A contract is a contract. Mrs. Hayes signed this document willingly. It stipulates a clean break and a predetermined, generous settlement. She is now attempting to rewrite history, to lay claim to a business she knows nothing about, driven by nothing more than bitterness and greed. When it was David Chen's turn, his approach was quieter, more deliberate. He spoke of partnership, of shared dreams, of sweat equity that doesn't show up on a balance sheet. Your Honor, he began, the document Mr. Vance refers to was signed by a 25-year-old woman in love, not a corporate strategist. It does not account for the 25 years of life support and foundational work that followed. Catherine Hayes was not a passenger on this journey. She was the navigator. Her architectural vision was the bedrock upon which Hayes' construction was built. To dismiss that, to erase her contribution, is not just a breach of fairness, but a breach of the marital contract itself in its truest sense. The first witnesses were financial experts, dueling accountants who presented conflicting valuations of the company and Catherine's lifestyle. It was a dry, numbing parade of numbers and jargon amortization, depreciation, asset allocation. Through it all, Catherine felt a growing sense of detachment, as if they were discussing the lives of strangers. Richard seemed bored, occasionally checking his Patek Philippe watch. Vanessa watched intently, her expression unreadable. After the lunch recess, the tone shifted. The financials were done. Now came the human element. Richard took the stand. Under Vance's gentle questioning, he portrayed himself as a tireless provider who had given his wife everything she could possibly desire, only to be met with ingratitude. He spoke of their growing apart, a slow, passionless drifting that he framed as a mutual parting of ways. He never mentioned Vanessa's name. Then came David Chen's cross-examination. Mr. Hayes Chen began, "You've stated that Mrs. Hayes made no substantive contribution to the business after the first few years. Is that correct? She was not an employee, no," Richard said smoothly. "But you continued to discuss business with her, did you not, over dinner? When you were facing a difficult project. I might have mentioned things as any husband would. Do you recall the Riverwood Estates project in 2008? The one that won the company the Developer of the Year award?" A flicker of something annoyance crossed Richard's face. "I do. And do you recall that the initial plans from your architects were rejected by the town planning board, twice threatening the entire project?" "There were some initial difficulties," Richard conceded. "And isn't it true," Chen pressed, "that your wife Catherine stayed up with you for 3 nights, reworking the site plans and community layout, using her architectural skills to create the design that was ultimately approved and celebrated, a contribution for which she was never paid or credited?" Richard shifted in his seat. "She may have offered some suggestions." Chen moved on, chipping away at Richard's facade, piece by piece, revealing a pattern of taking Catherine's ideas and support for granted, of slowly and methodically erasing her from the company's history. By the time he was finished, the image of the generous provider had been replaced by that of a calculating user. But Vance was a master of redirection. He knew the real battle would be Catherine's testimony, and as Judge Reed called a recess for the day, announcing that Catherine Hayes would take the stand, first thing in the morning, a sense of dread settled deep in Catherine's stomach. She glanced at the gallery. Vanessa caught her eye, and for the first time that day, she offered a small, chilling smile. It was a promise of the pain that was to come. The day of reckoning had only just begun. The witness stand felt like a small wooden island in a hostile sea. The microphone amplified the nervous tremor in Catherine's voice as she answered David Chen's initial questions, recounting the early days of her marriage and her role in the company. She spoke of their shared excitement, the smell of sawdust and fresh paint, the feeling that they were building a world together, not just houses. Her testimony was heartfelt, a poignant reminder of a past Richard had tried so hard to bury. Then Gregory Vance rose for his cross-examination. He approached the stand with a slow, deliberate pace, his smile thin and predatory. "Mrs. Hayes," he began, his tone deceptively gentle, "you've painted a very romantic picture of your early years, but let's talk about the last decade. Shall we? You testified that you felt your husband was distant. Isn't it true that you yourself were often unavailable?" "What? No, that's not true," Catherine stammered. "Really, let's look at your schedule. The Philharmonic Board meetings, the museum galas, the charity luncheons, the spa weekends with your friends. It seems you had a very full, very active social life. A life, I might add, funded entirely by Mr. Hayes's hard work." "That was my role," Catherine said, her voice rising slightly. "That's what Richard wanted me to do, to be his public face to network." "To network or to socialize?" Vance cut in. While Mr. Hayes was flying to Dubai to secure a $1 billion contract, you were at a wine tasting in Napa. While he was in grueling negotiations in Tokyo, you were at a tennis clinic in Palm Beach. Is that not correct? He was twisting her life into a caricature of a bored, wealthy socialite. Every charity event was framed as a party, every board meeting a luncheon. He made her contributions sound like frivolous hobbies. You speak of your early architectural work, Vance continued, but you haven't designed a building in over 20 years. Isn't it more accurate to say that you weren't a partner, Mrs. Hayes, but rather the first and most expensive project Mr. Hayes ever funded? The cruelty of the question hung in the air. David Chen shot to his feet. Objection. Your Honor, counsel is badgering the witness. Sustained. Judge Reed said, her eyes fixed on Catherine. Mr. Vance, rephrase. But the blow had landed. Catherine felt the carefully constructed walls of her composure begin to crumble. She felt the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on her, felt their judgment. She glanced at Richard, who was studying his fingernails, utterly detached. Then her gaze drifted to the gallery. Vanessa Thorne was leaning forward slightly, her chin resting on her hand, an expression of rapt attention on her face. She looked like someone enjoying a particularly satisfying piece of theatre. Vance pressed on his questions, becoming more personal, more invasive. He brought up extravagant purchases, insinuating she was financially irresponsible. He twisted her words, making her sound petty and materialistic. He was dismantling her character, her history, her worth, all in the service of protecting Richard's fortune. Mrs. Hayes, at the end of the day, what is it you really want? Vance asked, his voice dripping with insinuation. You've been offered a settlement that would allow you to live in luxury for the rest of your life. Why isn't that enough? Is this all just about punishing Mr. Hayes for moving on? The question was a cocktail of accusation and dismissal. It implied that her fight for recognition was nothing more than a vindictive tantrum. It reduced her 25-year partnership to a footnote in the story of Richard's success. It was the culmination of every belittling comment, every dismissive gesture, every cold shoulder she had endured for years, and she broke. A single sob escaped her lips, a raw, ragged sound of profound grief. She tried to stifle it, raising a trembling hand to her mouth, but it was too late. The tears she had been fighting back for hours finally fell, tracing hot paths down her cheeks. She was not just crying for her marriage, but for the woman she used to be, for the dreams she had sacrificed, for the utter humiliation of having her life's work dismissed as a hobby. In the heavy silence of the courtroom, punctuated only by Catherine's choked sobs, a small movement caught her eye. It was Vanessa. As Catherine wept, Vanessa's perfectly painted lips curled upwards at the corners. It wasn't a smile of joy, but a smirk of pure, unadulterated triumph. Her eyes glinted with cold satisfaction. Then she raised a hand to her mouth to cover a tiny, almost inaudible scoff. It was a gesture of utter contempt, a silent mockery of the wife's tears. "You pathetic creature," the look said. "Your pain is my victory." She thought no one saw. But she was wrong. Catherine saw it. The mockery was a splash of icy water, shocking her out of her grief and into a cold, sharp fury. And from her elevated bench, Judge Evelyn Reed, whose gaze missed nothing, saw it too. The judge's eyes narrowed, her expression hardening from one of judicial impartiality to something far more dangerous. The air in the room grew taut, electric. The gears of justice were about to shift in a way no one could have ever predicted. Judge Evelyn Reed held up a hand, silencing Gregory Vance mid-sentence as he prepared to deliver what was sure to be a final crushing question. The judge's gaze was not on the witness or the lawyers. It was locked directly on the first row of the gallery. "Ms. Thorne," Judge Reed said, her voice dangerously calm. It cut through the tense silence of the courtroom like a surgeon's scalpel. Vanessa Thorne, who had just settled back in her seat, looked up, a flicker of surprise on her face. The smirk was gone, replaced by a mask of polite neutrality. "Your Honor, you are Vanessa Thorne. Are you not a consultant for Hayes Construction?" "Yes, Your Honor," Vanessa replied, her voice smooth. "I see." The judge continued, her eyes never leaving Vanessa's face. "The court appreciates your attendance and keen interest in these proceedings. Perhaps then you can assist us with a small matter of financial curiosity that has arisen during my review of the evidence." A ripple of confusion went through the courtroom. Gregory Vance and David Chen exchanged a bewildered look. This was highly unorthodox. Judge Reed picked up a thick binder from her desk. Exhibit 34B, the corporate financials for Hayes Construction. "Mr. Vance, your client has presented these documents as a complete and accurate representation of the company's finances. Is that correct?" "Yes, of course, Your Honor." Vance said, a note of unease creeping into his voice. "Excellent," the judge said, flipping through several pages. "Then I'm sure you can easily clarify something for me. I'm looking at the disbursement records for the last 3 fiscal years. I see a series of substantial, recurring monthly payments made out to a consulting firm, a firm by the name of Thorne Innovations, LLC. She looked up again, her gaze like a physical weight pressing down on Vanessa. "Ms. Thorne, are you the principal of this company?" Vanessa's composure faltered for the first time. A slight flush rose on her neck. Yes, Your Honor. It's my consulting firm." At the defendant's table, Richard Hayes went rigid. He shot a panicked look at Vanessa, then at his lawyer. The air of bored indifference had vanished, replaced by a stark, primal fear. "I see," Judge Reed said again, her tone glacial. "And what specific consulting services did Thorne Innovations provide to Hayes Construction to warrant payments totaling—" "Let me see." She paused, running a finger down a column. "Just over $4.2 million over 36 months. The figure dropped into the courtroom like a stone. $4.2 million. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Catherine stared, her tears forgotten, her mind struggling to process the number. "We provided strategic development and market analysis." Vanessa managed her voice, suddenly thin. "Strategic development," the judge repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "That's a rather nebulous term for such a concrete sum of money. There are no detailed invoices in this file, Ms. Thorne. No project reports, no deliverables, just monthly wire transfers. It's almost as if Thorne Innovations is a pass-through. A shell corporation." Gregory Vance shot to his feet. "Your Honor, I object. The court is speculating, and this line of questioning is completely inappropriate. Ms. Thorne is not on trial here." "Mr. Vance, sit down," Judge Reed commanded, her voice cracking like a whip. "Your client submitted these documents under penalty of perjury. As an officer of the court, I am not only permitted, but obligated to question evidence that appears to be fraudulent. And right now, this looks very much like the systematic siphoning of marital assets prior to a divorce proceeding." She turned her attention to the defendant's table. "Mr. Hayes, these payments to Ms. Thorne's company, were they declared as part of your total compensation package? Were they disclosed to your wife, whose contributions we are here to adjudicate?" Richard was pale, his face slick with a sudden sweat. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at Vance, who seemed equally stunned into silence. The judge wasn't finished. "Because what this looks like to me, Mr. Hayes, is a conspiracy. It looks like you have been funneling millions of dollars from the marital estate into the pockets of your mistress, using a sham consulting firm to disguise the theft. You have deliberately and fraudulently misrepresented the value of Hayes Construction to this court and to your wife. You have lied on your financial affidavits. You have, in essence, been embezzling from your own family. The room was utterly, completely silent. The only sound was the frantic clicking of the court stenographer's machine, capturing every devastating word. Vanessa Thorne looked as if she had been turned to stone, her chic cream-colored dress suddenly looking like a funeral shroud. The smug victor, the woman who had mocked the wife's tears, was now exposed as a common grifter, a co-conspirator in a multi-million-dollar fraud. Judge Reed closed the binder with a resounding thud that made everyone jump. "This divorce proceeding is hereby suspended," she announced, her voice ringing with authority. "I am ordering a full independent forensic audit of Hayes Construction's books, effective immediately. I am also ordering a freeze on all personal and corporate assets belonging to Mr. Hayes and Ms. Thorne, pending the outcome of that audit." She then looked directly at the grim-faced district attorney, who happened to be observing in the back of the courtroom. "And I will be referring this entire matter to the district attorney's office for a criminal investigation into conspiracy, embezzlement, and perjury." The judge's final words silenced the room more profoundly than any outburst could have. Catherine Hayes looked from her husband's ashen face to his mistress's mask of horror, and she finally understood. Her tears hadn't been a sign of weakness. They had been the prelude to a storm of justice she could never have imagined. The 6 months that followed the courtroom bombshell were a maelstrom of legal activity. The forensic audit Judge Reed had ordered was a deep, invasive surgery on the body of Hayes Construction, and it uncovered a cancer of corruption that ran deeper than anyone had imagined. Thorne Innovations was just the tip of the iceberg. Richard, with Vanessa's help, had been systematically bleeding the company for years through a network of shell corporations, inflated invoices, and kickback schemes. He had been building a separate financial empire in the shadows, one he intended to share with Vanessa after discarding Catherine with a pittance. Faced with an ironclad criminal case, Richard and Vanessa turned on each other. Their affair, born of mutual greed and ambition, curdled into bitter recrimination. In the end, Richard Hayes, the titan of industry, pleaded guilty to multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement to avoid a longer sentence. He was sentenced to 5 years in a federal white-collar prison. His reputation was destroyed, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale. Vanessa Thorne, refusing any plea deal in a fit of misguided arrogance, was convicted by a jury. Her attempts to portray herself as an innocent dupe fell flat. She was sentenced to 3 years and was ordered to pay back every cent she had received through her fraudulent company. The cream-colored dress she wore on her day of reckoning in divorce court was replaced by a standard-issue prison uniform. For Catherine, the revelations were both devastating and liberating. The man she had loved and built a life with was a stranger, a thief who had been stealing from her and their shared dream for years. But the truth, however ugly, set her free. The divorce proceedings resumed, but the landscape had completely changed. With Richard's crimes laid bare, the prenuptial agreement was thrown out as fraudulent. The settlement negotiations were no longer about a small allowance, but about the division of a tarnished but still valuable empire. David Chen, now armed with the full truth, was relentless. In the end, Catherine didn't just get the house. She was awarded a 60% controlling interest in Hayes Construction. She was no longer the discarded wife. She was the majority owner. The first year was the hardest. She had to clean house, firing the executives who had been complicit in Richard's schemes and rebuilding the trust of her employees and clients. She worked tirelessly, rediscovering the passion and drive she had suppressed for so long. She didn't just run the company, she transformed it. She started by changing the name. Hayes Construction became Shaw Designs and Building, reclaiming her maiden name, her true identity. She moved the corporate headquarters from its sterile, impersonal skyscraper to a beautifully renovated brick warehouse, creating a collaborative, open-plan space. And she went back to her roots. She dusted off her old portfolio, not as a relic of the past, but as a blueprint for the future. She personally took the lead on a new project, an innovative community of affordable, beautifully designed homes that used sustainable materials. It was a project that valued community and artistry over sheer profit, the kind of work she had always dreamed of doing. One crisp autumn afternoon, a little over 2 years after that fateful day in court, Catherine stood on a hill overlooking the bustling construction site of her new project. She was no longer in a Chanel suit, but in jeans, worn leather boots, and a hard hat, a roll of blueprints tucked under her arm. The setting sun cast a warm glow on the wooden frames of the rising houses. She felt a profound sense of peace. She had not just survived, she had rebuilt. She had taken the rubble of a life built on lies and used it to lay a new, stronger foundation, one that was entirely her own. She had lost a husband and a life she thought she knew, but she had found something far more valuable herself. The echo of emptiness in her old house had been replaced by the ringing sound of hammers, the sound of a future she was building with her own 2 hands. 4 years after the trial, the name Catherine Shaw was synonymous with innovation and integrity in the architectural world. Shaw Designs and Building had become a regional powerhouse, celebrated not just for its stunning, eco-conscious designs, but for its ethical business practices and community engagement. The ghost of Hayes Construction had been fully exorcised, replaced by a legacy Catherine was building on a foundation of her own making. Her life was orderly, fulfilling, and peaceful. The chaotic, painful past felt like a story she had read about someone else. Then the letter arrived. It was a plain manila envelope, forwarded from her lawyer's office. Inside, a single sheet of official-looking paper from the Federal Bureau of Prisons informed her, as the primary victim in his case, that Richard Hayes was being granted an early release on parole for good behavior. He had served just under 3 years of his 5-year sentence. He would be a free man in 2 weeks. Catherine read the words, and for the first time in a long time, the cool marble floors of her old life seemed to press up against the soles of her feet. It wasn't fear she felt, nor was it anger. It was a cold, heavy resignation, the feeling one gets when an old chronic injury begins to ache with a change in the weather. He was a storm from the past, and he was rolling back toward her shore. She called David Chen, her voice even. "I got the notification," she said simply. "I thought you might," he replied. "There's a restraining order in place, Catherine. He's not to contact you or come within 500 feet of your home or place of business. If he violates it, he goes right back inside." "I know," she said, looking out her office window at the city skyline she was helping to reshape. "But he will try, David. He's Richard. He thinks the rules are for other people." She was right. 10 days later, her assistant, a bright young woman named Maya, buzzed her on the intercom. "Miss Shaw, I'm sorry to bother you, but there's a man here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment. He says his name is Richard." The cold ache returned, but this time it was joined by a surge of steely resolve. This was her company, her sanctuary. He had no power here. "Thank you, Maya. I'll be right out." She walked out of her glass-walled office and into the bustling, open-plan studio. Her employees, a vibrant mix of young architects and seasoned engineers, were collaborating around drafting tables and 3D printers. The air hummed with creativity. It was the world she had built. At the reception desk stood the man who had tried to tear her world down. The bespoke suits were gone. He wore an ill-fitting grey blazer and trousers that were slightly too short. The confident swagger had been replaced by a weary stoop. He had lost weight, and his face, once tan and commanding, was pale and etched with lines of anxiety. The Patek Philippe watch was gone, his wrist bare. He was a ghost of the man he had been, a faded photograph of power. He saw her, and his face flooded with a complex mix of hope and shame. "Catherine," he said, his voice raspy. "Richard," she replied, her tone cool and level. She didn't move toward him. She stood her ground, forcing him to be the one on display in the middle of her world. "You are in violation of a court order. I know. I'm sorry. I had to see you," he pleaded, taking a hesitant step forward. "Can we talk? Just for 5 minutes. In your office?" She considered calling security. She considered letting Maya call the police. But looking at the diminished man before her, she felt not fear, but a strange clinical curiosity. She wanted this to be over, truly over. And for that, the final word had to be hers. "Fine," she said, turning on her heel. 5 minutes. In her office, he seemed even smaller, swallowed by the light and space. He looked around at the models of her new projects, at the awards lining her shelves. "You've done all this," he said, a note of awe in his voice. "It's incredible." "What do you want, Richard?" she asked, remaining standing behind her large oak desk. He finally met her eyes. "I wanted to apologize," he said, the words sounding rehearsed. "What I did to you, to the company, it was wrong. Prison gives you a lot of time to think. I see that now. I destroyed everything that mattered." "You destroyed a lie, Richard," she corrected him. "I built something real from the rubble." He winced. "I know. Catherine, I'm lost. My name is poison. No one will hire me. My bank accounts are gone. I'm staying in a halfway house. I have nothing." And there it was, the true reason for his visit. It wasn't about absolution. It was about a transaction. It always was with him. "So you came here," she stated, "to the company you stole from, to the woman you betrayed, to ask for a handout." Tears welled in his eyes, and she wondered if they were real or just another tool from his depleted arsenal. "I don't know what else to do," he whispered. "Alone, a job, anything. I could be a consultant. I still know the business." The sheer breathtaking audacity of it almost made her laugh. A consultant, the same title he had given Vanessa. She walked around the desk and stood before him, looking down at the man who had once held absolute power over her life. "No," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. "There is nothing for you here. The business you knew is gone. It was corrupt and hollow, just like our marriage. This company is built on transparency and trust, two concepts you've never understood." She went to her desk, took out a checkbook and wrote. She slid the check across the desk to him. It was for $5,000. "This is not a loan," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "This is the last thing you will ever receive from me. It's your severance package from my life. Take it, and you will walk out that door and never contact me, our son, or anyone at this company again. You will become a ghost. If I ever see or hear from you again, I won't hesitate to send you back to prison. Do you understand?" He stared at the check, then at her face, searching for a flicker of the old Catherine, the soft, accommodating wife. He found none. He saw only a stranger, a woman of formidable strength and absolute certainty. He slowly picked up the check, folded it and put it in his pocket. "I understand," he mumbled. He walked to the door, a defeated man. He paused with his hand on the handle. "For what it's worth," he said, not turning around. "I really am sorry." Then he was gone. Catherine stood alone in her office for a long moment. She didn't feel triumphant or vengeful. She felt a profound sense of quiet. The final echo had faded. The last loose thread had been snipped. She walked to the window, not looking down at the street where Richard was disappearing, but up at the sky where the steel skeleton of her latest project was rising to meet the clouds. Her past was a finished blueprint filed away. Her future was still being designed, and for the first time, the drafting table was entirely, completely clear. Catherine's journey from a weeping wife in a courtroom to the confident leader of her own company is a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It's a story that proves that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of coming to the surface, often in the most dramatic and unexpected fashion. The smirk of an arrogant mistress became the catalyst for her own downfall, and the tears of a wronged woman became the water that nourished the seeds of her own strength. Justice isn't always swift, and it isn't always silent, but as Judge Reed proved, it can be incredibly thorough. If Catherine's story of strength and ultimate vindication resonated with you, please show your support for stories like this one. Hit that like button. It truly helps our channel grow and reach more people who need to hear that it's possible to rebuild from the ashes. Share this video with a friend who might be facing their own battle, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. You won't want to miss our next story of how the tables turn when you least expect it. Thank you for listening.